Hello, dear travelers, and welcome back to the Sleepyhead Geographer. Tonight we shall travel back together, back through time to a world that existed before cities, before forests as we know them today. A world where the northern reaches of our planet were covered by something extraordinary, the largest ecosystem Earth has ever known. Picture vast grasslands stretching from Spain to Canada, from the Arctic Ocean to the mountains of Asia. Imagine endless seas of grass beneath cold, brilliant skies. This was the Mammoth Steppe, a land of giants where woolly behemoths walked across frozen ground, where the thunder of hooves echoed for thousands of miles. We're going to discover together how this incredible world worked, how it fed more large animals than any ecosystem before or since, how it shaped the very climate of our planet, and how in just a few thousand years it vanished forever, leaving only whispers in the wind and bones in the permafrost. Let's step quietly into this ancient realm, where every breath you take mingles with the cold air that once filled the lungs of mammoths, where every footstep follows paths worn by creatures beyond imagination. 100,000 years ago, the Earth was a very different place. The ice sheets of the last major glaciation were beginning to form, locking away vast quantities of water and dropping sea levels by hundreds of feet. As the great ice caps grew in the Arctic and on mountain ranges, they created something remarkable, the perfect conditions for the birth of the Mammoth Steppe. Let's imagine ourselves standing on what would one day become the Bering Land Bridge, watching as this transformation began. The retreating seas exposed vast expanses of the continental shelf, creating new land that stretched between Asia and North America. This wasn't just any land. It was perfectly positioned to catch the cold, dry winds flowing off the massive ice sheets. The climate that emerged was unlike anything we see today. Picture air so dry it seemed to crackle, carrying little moisture but plenty of fine dust and nutrients. The summers were brief but surprisingly warm, while winters stretched for 8 long months, with temperatures that could drop to 50 degrees below zero. Yet this harsh climate was exactly what was needed. The cold, dry air prevented the formation of thick snow cover that would have buried the land in winter. Instead, the wind swept most areas clear, leaving only a thin layer of snow that large animals could easily push aside with their massive heads and powerful limbs. The permafrost beneath the surface stayed frozen year-round, creating a solid foundation that prevented waterlogging during the brief summer thaw. As we watch this ancient landscape take shape, we can see how the geography itself encouraged the grasslands. The relatively flat terrain, punctuated by gentle hills and river valleys, allowed the cold winds to flow unobstructed across thousands of miles. These winds carried seeds from distant places, creating a mixing ground where plants from different regions could meet and establish new communities. The soil that formed was special too, a rich, dark earth created from the constant deposit of fine dust blown by the winds. This dust, called loess, came from the grinding action of glaciers and the erosion of exposed rock faces. It settled across the landscape like a thin blanket of fertilizer, creating the foundation for what would become the most productive grassland ecosystem in Earth's history. But the steppe didn't appear overnight. Over thousands of years, we can imagine watching as pioneering plants began to colonize this new world. Hardy grasses were among the first to establish themselves, their deep root systems perfect for accessing water stored in the upper layers of permafrost. Sedges followed, along with small flowering plants and herbs that could tolerate the extreme conditions. These early plant communities began to modify their own environment. Their roots helped stabilize the soil, preventing erosion. Their above-ground parts trapped snow in winter, creating small pockets of insulation. During the brief summers, their decay added organic matter to the soil, gradually building up the dark, rich earth that would sustain millions of large animals. The establishment of these grassland created a feedback loop that reinforced the very conditions that allowed them to exist. The light-colored grass reflected more sunlight than darker forest vegetation would have, helping to keep the ground cool and maintaining the permafrost. The plants themselves produced less moisture than trees, maintaining the dry conditions they needed. As centuries passed, this grassland empire expanded. From its beginnings in the exposed continental shelves and ice-free corridors, it spread across Siberia, Alaska, and parts of Europe. The Mammoth Steppe eventually covered more than 5 million square miles, an area larger than the entire United States. The sheer scale of this ecosystem is difficult for us to comprehend. Imagine traveling north from the Black Sea, walking for months through unbroken grassland until you reached the Arctic Ocean. Then turn west and walk for months more, through more grassland, until you reached the Atlantic. Turn north again and continue through Scandinavia, across the islands of the Arctic, over the Bering Land Bridge, and into Alaska and northern Canada. All of this was one continuous ecosystem, home to communities of plants and animals adapted to conditions we can barely imagine. The productivity of this landscape was extraordinary. Scientists studying ancient bones and plant remains have calculated that the Mammoth Steppe supported more large animals per square mile than the richest African savannas do today. The secret lay in the unique growing conditions created by the climate and geography. During the brief but intense summer growing season, the plants had access to abundant nutrients from the rich, lush soils, constant sunlight from the midnight sun at high latitudes, and just enough moisture from snowmelt and summer rains. The permafrost beneath acted like an underground reservoir, slowly releasing water throughout the growing season. But perhaps most importantly, the Mammoth Steppe was perfectly adapted to its animal inhabitants. The grasses and herbs that dominated were exactly the types of plants that large grazers prefer, high in nutrition, digestible, and available year-round. Even in winter, when the surface plants were dormant, the nutritious root systems and stored plant parts provided food for animals that knew how to find them. This ancient world was not uniform across its vast extent. River valleys provided shelter and slightly different growing conditions. Coastal areas were milder and wetter. Some regions had more hills and varied topography. But everywhere, the fundamental character remained the same. Cold, dry grassland, supporting an abundance of life beyond anything we see in today's world. The birth of the Mammoth Steppe represents one of the most successful ecosystem developments in Earth's history. It was perfectly adapted to its time and place, taking advantage of unique climatic conditions to create something that had never existed before and has never existed since. This vast grassland empire set the stage for one of the most remarkable periods in the history of life on Earth. To understand the Mammoth Steppe, we must first understand the climate that created and sustained it, a climate so different from anything we experience today that it might as well have existed on another planet. Let's step into this ancient world and feel the bite of its winter winds, the brief warmth of its summer sun, and the crystal-clear air that could carry sounds for miles across the endless grasslands. The climate of the Mammoth Steppe was dominated by what scientists call continental conditions, the kind of weather that develops far from the moderating influence of oceans, under skies that could be brilliantly clear for days at a time. Imagine standing on the vast plain on a winter morning, breathing air so cold and dry it seems to freeze in your lungs, yet so clear you can see for 50 miles in every direction. Winter was the defining season of the Mammoth Steppe. For 8 months of the year, temperatures remained well below freezing, often dropping to 40 or 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. But this cold was different from the wet, penetrating cold we might experience today. It was a dry cold, sharp and clean, that came with intensely blue skies and air so still you could hear your own heartbeat echoing across the landscape. The lack of moisture in the air was crucial to the ecosystem's success. Modern tundra regions receive substantial snowfall that blankets the ground for most of the year, making plant life inaccessible to large animals. But the Mammoth Steppe received much less precipitation, perhaps only 6 to 8 inches per year, compared to the 20 or more inches that modern tundra typically receives. This meant that snow cover was usually thin and patchy. Strong winds, unobstructed by trees across thousands of miles of flat terrain, would sweep most areas nearly bare of snow. Where snow did accumulate, it was often wind-packed and relatively shallow, perfect for large animals with powerful necks and muscular trunks who could sweep it aside to reach the grass beneath. The winter wind patterns were remarkable in their consistency and strength. Cold air masses would build over the massive ice sheets and then flow outward, creating steady winds that could blow for days without changing direction. These winds carried fine particles of dust and organic matter across vast distances, distributing nutrients throughout the ecosystem and helping to maintain the fertility of the soils. But it was the brief summer that truly made the Mammoth Steppe special. For 3 or 4 months each year, this cold desert would transform into one of the most productive landscapes on Earth. The transformation began gradually in late spring, as the sun climbed higher in the sky and stayed above the horizon for longer periods each day. The summer growing season was intense and compressed. Temperatures could rise to 70 or even 80 degrees Fahrenheit, creating a striking contrast to the bitter winter cold. The permafrost beneath the surface would thaw only in its uppermost layers, creating a shallow but rich growing medium for plants. During these summer months, the sun barely set in the northern regions of the Mammoth Steppe. The midnight sun provided plants with nearly continuous light for photosynthesis, allowing them to grow with incredible rapidity. A grass seed that germinated in early June might produce a mature, seed-bearing plant by late July. The quality of light during the Mammoth Steppe's summer was extraordinary. The clear, dry air allowed sunlight to reach the ground with minimal filtering or distortion. Plants received intense radiation that drove rapid growth, while the long photoperiods allowed them to photosynthesize for 20 hours or more each day. Summer precipitation came primarily from brief but intense thunderstorms that would sweep across the grasslands, dumping large amounts of rain in short periods before moving on. These storms were often accompanied by spectacular lightning displays that could be seen for hundreds of miles across the flat terrain. The brief deluges would soak into the thawed surface layer, providing plants with the moisture they needed for their rapid summer growth. The seasonal temperature swings were extreme, from 50 below zero in winter to 80 above in summer, a range of more than 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Modern ecosystems rarely experience such dramatic variations, but the plants and animals of the Mammoth Steppe were perfectly adapted to these conditions. The autumn transition was rapid and dramatic. As the sun began to set earlier each day and temperatures dropped, the brief growing season would come to an abrupt end. Plants would quickly transfer nutrients to their root systems and prepare for the long winter dormancy. The ground would freeze, sometimes within a matter of days, locking the ecosystem into its winter state. Humidity levels throughout the year remained remarkably low. Even during the summer growing season, the air rarely felt muggy or oppressive. This low humidity had several important effects on the ecosystem. It reduced the growth of mosses and other moisture-loving plants that might have competed with grasses. It also meant that dead plant material didn't decay quickly, instead accumulating in the soil and contributing to the rich organic matter that characterized Mammoth Steppe soils. The wind patterns created microclimates throughout the vast steppe. River valleys were slightly warmer and more sheltered, creating refuges where different types of plants could survive. South-facing slopes received more direct sunlight and stayed warmer, while north-facing slopes remained cooler and held snow longer. These variations created a mosaic of slightly different conditions that supported greater plant and animal diversity. Atmospheric pressure patterns were also important to the Mammoth Steppe climate. High-pressure systems dominated, bringing the clear skies and stable weather conditions that characterized the ecosystem. These high-pressure systems were associated with the cold air masses flowing off the ice sheets, creating the anticyclonic weather patterns that kept storms away and maintained the dry conditions. The clarity of the atmosphere was extraordinary. Without the water vapor, dust, and pollution that characterize many modern climates, visibility could extend for enormous distances. Animals could see approaching weather systems, predators, or food sources from dozens of miles away. The stars at night shone with a brilliance that would be impossible to imagine in our modern world of light pollution and atmospheric haze. Temperature inversions were common, especially in winter, when cold air would settle in valleys and low-lying areas while warmer air remained aloft. These inversions created complex patterns of heat and cold across the landscape, influencing where different plants and animals could survive. The length and intensity of the seasons meant that life had to be perfectly timed to take advantage of the brief growing period. Plants had to complete their entire annual cycle in just a few months, while animals had to build up enough fat reserves during the summer to survive the long winter fast. This climate created what ecologists call a pulse reserve ecosystem, where most biological activity was concentrated into brief periods of intense productivity, followed by long periods of dormancy and survival on stored resources. It was a boom and bust cycle, but one that, when it worked, could support incredible abundance of life. The climate of the Mammoth Steppe was not just a backdrop for life. It was an active participant in shaping the ecosystem. The constant winds distributed seeds and nutrients. The freeze-thaw cycles broke down organic matter and renewed soil fertility. The extreme seasonal variations selected for hardy, adaptable species that could thrive under these challenging conditions. Understanding this climate helps us appreciate just how remarkable the Mammoth Steppe was. It took a very specific combination of temperature, precipitation, wind, and seasonal patterns to create and maintain this ecosystem. When that climate changed at the end of the Ice Age, the Mammoth Steppe could not adapt quickly enough to survive. In the heart of the Mammoth Steppe's success lay its plants, not towering trees or colorful wildflowers, but humble grasses and hardy herbs that possessed almost magical abilities to thrive in conditions that would defeat most vegetation. These were the foundation species that fed more large animals than any ecosystem in Earth's history, and their story is one of remarkable adaptation to an extreme world. Let's kneel down in this ancient grassland and examine the plants that made it all possible. The dominant species were not like the manicured grasses of modern lawns or even the tall prairie grasses we see today. These were specialized plants, evolved over thousands of years to extract maximum nutrition from minimal resources and to survive in conditions that swung from brutal cold to intense summer heat. The most important grasses belonged to genera that still exist today, but in much reduced forms. Festuca, Poa, and Steppe species dominated vast areas, their scientific names hardly capturing the crucial role they played in supporting millions of large mammals. These grasses had several remarkable characteristics that made them perfect for their harsh environment. Their root systems were extraordinary, dense networks that could extend several feet deep into the soil, reaching down to tap moisture and nutrients from the upper layers of permafrost. Unlike modern grasses that might have relatively shallow roots, Mammoth Steppe grasses invested heavily in underground architecture. Sometimes more than 70% of the plant's total biomass was below ground, invisible to casual observation, but absolutely critical to survival. These extensive root systems served multiple purposes. They anchored the plants against the constant winds that swept across the unforested landscape. They allowed the plants to access water and nutrients from deep in the soil profile. And crucially, they stored large quantities of carbohydrates and proteins that could sustain the plant through the long winter months and provide rapid energy for spring growth. The above-ground portions of these grasses were equally well adapted. The leaves were narrow and often had waxy coatings that helped prevent water loss during the dry conditions. Many species had the ability to roll their leaves during periods of water stress, reducing the surface area exposed to drying winds. The stems were strong but flexible, able to bend without breaking under the weight of snow or the pressure of wind. One of the most remarkable features of Mammoth Steppe grasses was their nutritional quality. Modern grasses in Arctic regions tend to be low in protein and high in difficult-to-digest compounds. But the grasses of the Mammoth Steppe were extraordinarily nutritious, with protein levels that could reach 15 to 20% of their dry weight, comparable to the best modern agricultural crops. This high nutritional value came from several sources. The rich, organic soils provided abundant nitrogen and other nutrients that the plants could incorporate into high-quality proteins. The intense summer growing conditions, with nearly continuous sunlight and adequate moisture, allowed rapid synthesis of nutritious compounds. And the short growing season meant that plants devoted their energy to producing high-quality tissue rather than the tough, structural materials needed for year-round survival. The seasonal cycle of these grasses was perfectly timed to the Mammoth Steppe climate. As soon as temperatures rose above freezing and the uppermost layer of soil thawed, the grasses would begin rapid growth using energy stored in their root systems. Within days, green shoots would emerge from what had appeared to be dead ground. During the brief but intense summer growing season, the grasses would grow with remarkable speed. Some species could grow several inches per week, quickly producing lush meadows where only frozen ground had existed weeks before. The plants seemed to understand that they had only a few months to complete their annual cycle, and they made the most of every day of favorable conditions. But the grasses of the Mammoth Steppe had another crucial adaptation. They remained nutritious and digestible even after they had dried and gone dormant. Modern Arctic grasses tend to become woody and indigestible once they mature, but Mammoth Steppe grasses retained much of their nutritional value even in their dried state. This meant that large herbivores could graze on the standing dead grass throughout the winter, sustaining themselves on what was essentially natural hay. Mixed in with the dominant grasses were numerous other plant species that added diversity and nutrition to the ecosystem. Sedges, members of the family Cyperaceae, were particularly important. These grass-like plants often grew in slightly wetter areas and provided additional variety in the diet of herbivores. Many sedge species had nutrient-rich seeds that were important food sources for smaller animals. Forbs, broad-leaved flowering plants, were scattered throughout the grassland, adding splashes of color during the brief summer blooming season and providing concentrated sources of vitamins and minerals. Species of Artemisia, the sagebrushes, were common in drier areas. Legumes, plants capable of fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere, helped maintain soil fertility across the vast landscape. The plant communities weren't uniform across the entire Mammoth Steppe. River valleys and low-lying areas that accumulated more moisture supported slightly different assemblages of species. South-facing slopes that received more direct sunlight might have different grass species than north-facing slopes. Areas with different soil conditions or microclimates would develop their own characteristic plant communities. But everywhere, the fundamental character was the same: cold-adapted, nutritious grasses and herbs that could complete their life cycles in just a few months and then survive 8 months of winter dormancy. These plants had evolved what ecologists call the fast-slow strategy: rapid growth and reproduction when conditions were favorable, followed by extended periods of minimal activity when conditions were harsh. The interaction between plants and herbivores was complex and crucial to the ecosystem's functioning. The constant grazing by millions of large animals actually helped maintain the grassland. Grazing prevented any single species from dominating and created a mosaic of different-aged plants across the landscape. The trampling by heavy animals broke up old plant material and created spaces for new seedlings to establish. The dung of the large herbivores was perhaps the most important fertilizer in the ecosystem. Mammoth dung, in particular, was rich in nutrients and could remain on the landscape for years before fully decomposing in the dry climate. This created patches of extraordinarily fertile soil that supported especially lush plant growth, which in turn attracted more animals, creating a positive feedback loop. Fire played an important role in maintaining the grassland communities. Lightning strikes during summer thunderstorms could ignite grass fires that would sweep across large areas of the steppe. These fires cleared away accumulated dead plant material, returned nutrients to the soil, and created opportunities for new plant establishment. The grasses were well adapted to fire, with their growing points protected below ground and their ability to rapidly regrow from root systems. The seeds of Mammoth Steppe plants were adapted for long-distance dispersal by wind. Many grass species had seeds with special structures that allowed them to be carried for hundreds of miles by the constant winds. This helped maintain genetic diversity across the vast ecosystem and allowed plant populations to rapidly colonize new areas of suitable habitat. Some plants had seeds that could remain viable in the soil for many years, germinating only when conditions were just right. This created a seed bank in the soil that helped ensure the persistence of plant communities even through periods of unfavorable conditions. The timing of seed production was crucial in the short Mammoth Steppe growing season. Plants had to flower, produce seeds, and ensure seed dispersal all within the brief summer window. This required precise coordination with environmental cues such as temperature and day length. Understanding these remarkable plants helps us appreciate the sophistication of the Mammoth Steppe ecosystem. These weren't simple primitive plants struggling to survive in harsh conditions. They were highly evolved species perfectly adapted to their environment, capable of supporting an abundance of animal life that has never been matched by any other ecosystem. Their disappearance at the end of the Ice Age represents the loss of plant communities that had taken thousands of years to develop and can never be recreated. At the heart of the Mammoth Steppe lived its most magnificent inhabitants and most important ecosystem engineers, the woolly mammoths. These weren't just large animals wandering across the grasslands. They were the architects of their own environment, constantly reshaping the landscape in ways that made it possible for the entire ecosystem to flourish. To understand the Mammoth Steppe, we must understand these remarkable giants and the profound impact they had on their world. Picture a fully grown woolly mammoth standing in the morning light of the ancient steppe. 11 feet tall at the shoulder, weighing as much as 6 tons, covered in a coat of coarse guard hairs and dense, soft underfur that could be 3 feet long. The massive, curved tusks, some growing to 14 feet in length, sweep gracefully from either side of the trunk. But impressive as these physical features were, it was what mammoths did with their enormous bodies that truly mattered. Mammoths were eating machines on a scale we can barely comprehend. An adult mammoth needed to consume between 400 and 700 pounds of vegetation every single day. To put this in perspective, that's equivalent to eating a small tree's worth of plant material daily. Over the course of a year, a single mammoth would consume roughly 100 tons of vegetation, and there were millions of mammoths across the Mammoth Steppe. But mammoths weren't just passive consumers of plants. They were selective eaters with sophisticated strategies for finding the best food. Their trunks, containing over 40,000 muscles, were incredibly sensitive instruments capable of detecting the most nutritious parts of plants. They could sense which grasses had the highest protein content, which roots contained the most stored energy, and which areas of the steppe offered the best foraging opportunities. During winter, when the surface vegetation was dormant, mammoths became landscape sculptors. They would use their powerful trunks and massive heads to sweep away snow, creating feeding craters that could be 6 feet across and several feet deep. These craters exposed the dried grasses and herb roots beneath, making food available not just to the mammoths, but to dozens of other animal species that followed in their wake. The physical impact of this snow removal was profound. By keeping large areas of the steppe clear of snow, mammoths prevented the insulating effect that thick snow cover would have had on the permafrost. This helped maintain the cold, stable soil conditions that the grassland plants required. Scientists studying modern permafrost have discovered that areas with heavy snow cover stay warmer in winter, while areas kept clear by animals remain colder and more stable. In summer, mammoth feeding behavior was equally important to ecosystem health. As they grazed, mammoths would often uproot entire plants, disturbing the soil and creating small patches of open ground where new seedlings could establish. Their massive feet, each one more than 18 inches across, would compact the soil in some areas while creating depressions in others, leading to a complex microgeography that supported different plant communities. The social behavior of mammoths amplified their ecosystem impact. These were highly social animals that lived in family groups led by experienced matriarchs. A typical family unit might consist of 8 to 12 individuals, ranging from tiny calves to massive adults. These family groups would often travel together in larger aggregations, sometimes numbering in the hundreds. When such large groups moved across the landscape, they created what ecologists call disturbance corridors, paths of trampled vegetation and disturbed soil that could extend for miles. Rather than being destructive, these corridors were actually beneficial to the ecosystem. They prevented any single area from becoming overgrazed while creating a mosaic of different habitat conditions across the landscape. Mammoth dung was perhaps their most important contribution to ecosystem productivity. Each mammoth produced approximately 400 pounds of dung per day, Imagine that multiplied across millions of individuals across millions of square miles. This dung was extraordinarily rich in nutrients, containing partially digested plant matter, beneficial bacteria, and concentrated minerals that had been extracted from deep in the soil by plant roots. The distribution of this fertilizer across the landscape was crucial to maintaining soil fertility. Unlike modern ecosystems, where large herbivore dung tends to be concentrated in small areas, mammoth dung was spread widely as the animals moved across their enormous ranges. A single family group might deposit nutrients across hundreds of square miles during their seasonal migrations. The dung didn't just fertilize the soil immediately. In the dry climate of the Mammoth Steppe, mammoth dung could persist for years without completely decomposing, creating long-term nutrient reservoirs that slowly released fertility into the ecosystem. Fossilized mammoth dung, found in Siberian permafrost, still contains identifiable plant materials after thousands of years. Mammoths also played a crucial role in seed dispersal across the vast steppe. Seeds from plants they consumed would pass through their digestive systems and be deposited miles away from where they were eaten, often in nutrient-rich dung that provided perfect growing conditions. This helped maintain genetic diversity in plant populations and allowed rapid colonization of new suitable habitats. Their migratory behavior was essential to ecosystem function. Mammoth families would undertake seasonal migrations that could cover hundreds of miles, following traditional routes passed down through generations of matriarchs. These migrations distributed grazing pressure across the landscape, preventing overgrazing in any single area, while ensuring that all parts of the steppe received the benefits of mammoth ecosystem engineering. The timing of these migrations was precise, coordinated with the seasonal cycles of plant growth and the availability of food resources. Spring migrations would follow the advancing wave of plant growth as winter snow retreated. Summer movements would track the peak productivity of different areas. Fall migrations would lead families to areas where dried vegetation was most abundant and accessible for winter feeding. Mammoths were also engineers of water resources. Their digging behavior, both while foraging and while creating wallows for dust baths and social interactions, would create small ponds and water holes that served other animals throughout the dry seasons. Their trails would channel water flow during spring snowmelt, creating the drainage patterns that prevented waterlogging of the permafrost soils. The social structure of mammoth herds was complex and sophisticated, with older females leading family groups and making crucial decisions about where and when to move. These matriarchs possessed decades of accumulated knowledge about the landscape, including the locations of the best feeding areas, reliable water sources, and safe routes across the terrain. Young mammoths learned the skills of ecosystem engineering through observation and practice. Calves would watch their mothers and other family members, demonstrating how to sweep away snow, how to select the most nutritious plants, and how to use their tusks and trunks to modify their environment. This cultural transmission of knowledge ensured that mammoth engineering skills were maintained across generations. The physical adaptations of mammoths were perfectly suited to their role as ecosystem engineers. Their wool-covered skin could withstand temperatures as low as -50 degrees Fahrenheit. Their small ears minimized heat loss while their large body mass helped them retain warmth. Their pillar-like legs could support enormous weight, while providing stable platforms for their earth-moving activities. Their tusks were multi-purpose tools used for digging through snow and frozen soil, stripping bark and roots, moving obstacles, and defending against predators. The curved shape of mammoth tusks was perfect for the sweeping motions needed to clear snow from feeding areas. The wear patterns on fossil tusks show evidence of their constant use as landscape modification tools. Perhaps most remarkably, mammoths seemed to understand the ecosystem-wide effects of their actions. Their behavior patterns suggest they were not just responding to immediate food needs, but were actively maintaining the grassland habitat that supported them. By preventing the encroachment of shrubs and trees, by maintaining soil fertility, and by creating the physical conditions needed for grass growth, mammoths were farming the steppe on a continental scale. The loss of these remarkable ecosystem engineers was catastrophic for the Mammoth Steppe. When mammoth populations declined and eventually disappeared, the intricate web of ecosystem processes they had maintained began to unravel. Without mammoth snow clearing, permafrost stability changed. Without mammoth fertilization, plant productivity declined. Without mammoth grazing and trampling, the carefully maintained grassland communities began to transform into the less productive tundra and forest ecosystems we see today. Understanding mammoths as ecosystem engineers helps us appreciate not just their impressive size and appearance, but their fundamental role in creating and maintaining one of Earth's most productive ecosystems. They were living bulldozers, fertilizer spreaders, seed dispersers, and landscape architects, all rolled into magnificent, woolly packages that thundered across the ancient world. Beyond the magnificent mammoths, the ancient steppe hosted an extraordinary assembly of creatures that would seem like mythical beasts to modern eyes. This was the great menagerie of the Mammoth Steppe, dozens of species of large mammals living together in numbers and diversity that no ecosystem on Earth supports today. Let's walk among these giants and discover how they shared the vast grasslands in an intricate dance of survival that lasted for tens of thousands of years. The woolly rhinoceros stood second only to the mammoth in its ability to shape the steppe environment. These massive creatures, standing 6 feet tall and weighing up to 4 tons, were covered in thick, shaggy coats and armed with enormous horns that could grow to 3 feet in length. Unlike their modern relatives living in warm climates, woolly rhinos were perfectly adapted to the cold, dry conditions of the Ice Age grasslands. Picture a woolly rhinoceros using its powerful horn to break through ice-crusted snow, revealing the nutritious dried grasses beneath. These animals were living snowplows, creating feeding areas that benefited many other species. Their broad, square lips were perfectly designed for cropping grass close to the ground, and their powerful digestive systems could extract nutrition from even the toughest dried vegetation. Woolly rhinos were solitary creatures, unlike the social mammoths, but their impact on the ecosystem was equally profound. A single rhino could clear several acres of snow-covered ground in a day's feeding, creating a network of accessible grazing areas across the winter landscape. Their dung, deposited in regular latrines, created concentrated fertility patches that supported especially lush plant growth during the following summer. The cave lion ruled as the apex predator of this ancient world, though despite its name, it was more closely related to modern lions than to any cave-dwelling species. These were enormous cats, 25% larger than modern African lions, with males weighing up to 800 pounds. Their powerful builds and cooperative hunting strategies made them formidable predators capable of bringing down even adult mammoths. Cave lions lived in family groups similar to modern lions, with several females and their cubs led by a dominant male. But unlike their modern relatives, cave lions had to adapt to the extreme seasonal variations of the Mammoth Steppe. During the long winters, when their prey was most vulnerable and concentrated around feeding areas cleared by mammoths and rhinos, cave lions would follow the herds, picking off the weak and unwary. The hunting strategies of cave lions were sophisticated and adapted to the open landscape of the steppe. With no trees to provide ambush cover, they relied on cooperative pack hunting, running down their prey across the flat grasslands. Their prey wasn't just the giants. Cave lions hunted everything from massive bison to swift horses, adapting their techniques to the size and behavior of their targets. Wild horses thundered across the Mammoth Steppe in vast herds that could number in the thousands. These weren't the sleek horses we know today, but stocky, powerful animals built for endurance in harsh conditions. Przewalski's horses, still surviving in small numbers today, give us a glimpse of what these ancient herds might have looked like: compact, muscular animals with thick coats and remarkable stamina. The horses of the Mammoth Steppe were ecological engineers in their own right. Their hooves were perfectly adapted for breaking through crusted snow and ice, and their grazing patterns helped maintain the grassland communities. Unlike cattle or bison, horses are able to graze very close to the ground, keeping grass communities short and preventing the invasion of shrubs and woody plants. Horse herds moved constantly across the steppe, following ancient migration routes that ensured no area was overgrazed. Their speed and mobility made them difficult prey even for cave lions, and their alert, nervous temperaments meant they served as early warning systems for other species when predators were near. Steppe bison roamed the grasslands in herds that rivaled the great buffalo herds of the North American plains. These were not quite the same as modern American bison. They were larger, with longer horns and more robust builds suited to the harsh steppe winters. Bulls could weigh nearly a ton and stood 6 feet tall at the shoulder, making them formidable opponents for any predator. Bison were perhaps the most effective grazers on the Mammoth Steppe. Their feeding behavior involved cropping grass to moderate heights, which stimulated new growth and maintained the productivity of the grasslands. Their wallowing behavior created shallow depressions that collected water and supported different plant communities, adding to the diversity of the ecosystem. During winter, bison herds would orient themselves to use their massive, shaggy heads as snow plows, following behind mammoths and rhinos to take advantage of the feeding areas these larger animals had cleared. This cooperative relationship, though unintentional, was crucial to the survival of all species during the harsh winter months. The musk ox, that living symbol of Arctic survival, was perfectly at home on the Mammoth Steppe. These remarkable animals, with their thick flowing coats and curved horns, were built like living fortresses against the cold. Adult bulls, weighing up to 900 pounds, could survive in temperatures that would be fatal to most other large mammals. Musk oxen had developed the ultimate cold weather survival strategy. When threatened by predators or extreme weather, they would form defensive circles with the adults facing outward, and the young protected in the center. This behavior, still seen in modern musk ox populations, was probably essential for surviving both the cave lions and the brutal winter storms of the ancient steppe. Their thick, insulating coats were marvels of biological engineering. The outer guard hairs were long and coarse, shedding water and snow, while the inner layer consisted of incredibly soft, warm wool called kiviut, so fine and warm that it's still considered one of the most valuable natural fibers in the world. Giant deer, known as Irish elk despite living far from Ireland and not being true elk, roamed the more southern regions of the Mammoth Steppe. The males of this species carried the largest antlers of any deer that ever lived, spreading up to 12 feet from tip to tip and weighing as much as 90 pounds. These magnificent antlers were displays of male fitness, advertising their bearers' ability to survive and thrive, despite carrying such an enormous burden. The giant deer were browsers rather than pure grazers, feeding on the shrubs and small trees that grew in the more sheltered valleys and southern edges of the steppe. Their presence helped maintain the boundary between pure grassland and the beginning of forest or shrubland communities. Wolves were the most adaptable predators of the Mammoth Steppe, capable of hunting everything from small prey to bringing down young mammoths through pack cooperation. These weren't quite the same as modern wolves. They were often larger and more robust, adapted to the extreme conditions and abundant large prey of the Ice Age world. Wolf packs on the Mammoth Steppe could be enormous, sometimes numbering 20 or 30 individuals. Such large packs were necessary to successfully hunt the giant herbivores that dominated the landscape. Their hunting strategies were sophisticated, involving complex cooperation and role specialization within the pack. The relationship between wolves and the large herbivores was complex. While wolves were certainly predators, they also played a crucial role in maintaining herd health by removing sick and weak individuals. Their presence influenced the movement patterns of herbivore herds, preventing overgrazing in any single area. Arctic foxes scavenged the kills left by larger predators and hunted small mammals that lived among the grasses. Their thick, white winter coats made them nearly invisible against the snow, and their compact builds minimized heat loss. These small predators were important links in the ecosystem's food web, helping to control populations of small mammals while serving as prey for larger predators. Ground squirrels, lemmings, and other small mammals lived in vast underground communities beneath the grasslands. These creatures were crucial to ecosystem function, aerating the soil through their burrowing activities and serving as important food sources for many predators. Their population cycles influenced the abundance of their predators and the intensity of predation pressure on other prey species. Ptarmigan, snow-white grouse perfectly camouflaged against the winter landscape, were among the few birds that could survive year-round on the Mammoth Steppe. Their feathered feet acted like natural snowshoes, and their ability to survive on buds and dried plant material made them independent of the insect and seed resources that other birds required. The seasonal migrations of waterfowl brought temporary abundance to the steppe during the brief summer months. Millions of ducks, geese, and swans would arrive to take advantage of the rich feeding opportunities and the countless small ponds and wetlands created by mammoth digging and seasonal flooding. Each species in this great menagerie had found its own niche within the Mammoth Steppe ecosystem. Some, like the mammoths and rhinos, were ecosystem engineers that actively modified their environment. Others, like the horses and bison, were mobile grazers that helped maintain grassland communities through their feeding patterns. Predators like cave lions and wolves controlled herbivore populations and influenced their behavior patterns. The interactions between species were complex and crucial. Mammoths clearing snow made feeding possible for smaller herbivores. Bison grazing stimulated grass growth that benefited all grazers. Predator pressure kept herbivore herds moving, preventing overgrazing. Even the dung of different species had different characteristics and contributed to ecosystem fertility in various ways. This was a world where competition and cooperation existed in delicate balance. Species that might seem to compete for the same resources had actually evolved subtle differences that allowed them to coexist. Mammoths favored certain types of grasses, while bison preferred others. Horses could graze in areas where the grass was too short for larger animals. Rhinos could access vegetation that other species couldn't reach. The seasonal cycles brought all these species together and spread them apart in predictable patterns. Winter concentrated animals around areas where food was accessible, creating intense interactions and high predation pressure. Summer abundance allowed populations to spread across the vast landscape, reducing competition and allowing for reproduction and growth. Understanding this great menagerie helps us appreciate the complexity and richness of the Mammoth Steppe ecosystem. This wasn't just a simple grassland with a few large animals. It was a sophisticated community of dozens of species, each playing crucial roles in maintaining the productivity and stability of the entire system. The loss of this biological diversity at the end of the Ice Age represents one of the greatest extinctions in Earth's recent history. In the vast expanse of the Mammoth Steppe, small bands of humans carved out their existence among giants, developing some of the most remarkable survival strategies in human history. These weren't primitive cave dwellers stumbling through a hostile world, but sophisticated hunter-gatherers whose intimate knowledge of the Ice Age environment allowed them to not just survive, but thrive alongside creatures that dwarfed them in size and strength. Let's step into the world of these Ice Age peoples and discover how they became part of the Mammoth Steppe ecosystem. Around 45,000 years ago, modern humans began spreading into the northern regions of Eurasia, following the vast herds and learning to exploit the resources of this cold grassland world. What they accomplished represents one of humanity's greatest adaptive achievements. The people of the Mammoth Steppe lived in small, highly mobile groups, rarely exceeding 30 to 40 individuals. These bands were typically extended families, led by experienced elders who possessed crucial knowledge about seasonal patterns, animal behavior, and resource locations. Every member of the group, from young children to elderly grandparents, played vital roles in the complex survival strategies that made life possible in this demanding environment. Their understanding of animal behavior was extraordinarily sophisticated. Mammoth steppe hunters could read the landscape like a book, interpreting tracks, dung, feeding signs, and behavioral cues to predict where different species would be at different times of year. They knew that mammoths would gather in certain valleys during harsh winter storms, that bison herds would follow specific migration routes in spring, and that horses would seek out particular types of grass during the brief summer growing season. This knowledge wasn't just practical, it was spiritual and cultural as well. These people developed rich mythologies and belief systems centered around the animals they lived among. Cave paintings, carved figurines, and other artistic works from this period show deep reverence for mammoths, bison, horses, and other steppe creatures. Animals weren't just sources of food and materials, they were partners in a complex relationship that defined human existence. The hunting strategies developed by Mammoth Steppe peoples were marvels of cooperation and planning. Taking down a mammoth, rhino, or large bison required coordinated efforts involving dozens of people and careful preparation. Archaeological evidence suggests they used sophisticated techniques including driving animals over cliffs, trapping them in natural or constructed enclosures, and using fire to control animal movements. But perhaps their most remarkable hunting innovation was the development of specialized weapons perfectly adapted to their prey and environment. They created spear points from stone, bone, and antler that could penetrate the thick hides of Ice Age giants. Their atlatls, spear-throwing devices, gave them the leverage needed to drive projectiles deep into massive targets. Some groups developed early forms of composite bows that remained flexible even in extreme cold. The relationship between humans and mammoths was particularly complex and intimate. Archaeological sites across the Mammoth Steppe reveal that humans used every part of these giant animals. Mammoth meat provided protein that could sustain families for months. The fat was crucial for surviving winter cold. both as high-energy food and as fuel for lamps that provided light and heat during the long polar nights. Mammoth bones became the framework for some of the most ingenious architecture in human history. On the treeless steppe, where wood was virtually unavailable, people learned to build substantial dwellings using mammoth skulls, ribs, and leg bones as structural elements. These bone houses, covered with mammoth hides and insulated with packed earth and vegetation, could house extended families through the brutal winter months. The famous mammoth bone houses of sites like Mezyryk in Ukraine used the bones of dozens of mammoths, representing careful collection over many years or perhaps generations. The construction of these dwellings required detailed understanding of engineering principles, how to create stable foundations in permafrost, how to design walls that could withstand intense winds, and how to create effective ventilation systems. Mammoth ivory became the raw material for tools, weapons, and art objects of extraordinary sophistication. The long, curved tusks were carved into spear points, needles for sewing clothing, and sculptures of remarkable artistic merit. Some ivory artifacts show evidence of being passed down through generations, becoming family heirlooms that carried cultural and spiritual significance beyond their practical value. Clothing technology was crucial for human survival on the Mammoth Steppe. The people developed sophisticated techniques for processing animal hides into warm, waterproof garments. They learned to use mammoth and bison hair to create insulating layers, and developed specialized clothing systems with multiple layers that could be adjusted for different activities and weather conditions. Archaeological evidence suggests these people could sew remarkably fine stitches using needles made from bone and ivory. Their clothing included tailored parkas, fitted trousers, and insulated boots. Clothing systems so effective that modern Arctic peoples use very similar designs. Some garments were decorated with intricate beadwork using carved ivory, colored stones, and other materials. The seasonal cycles that governed all life on the Mammoth Steppe also structured human existence. Summer was the time for following herds across the vast grasslands, taking advantage of the abundance and mobility that the warm months provided. Families would spread across the landscape in small hunting bands, covering enormous distances and maintaining contact with other groups through sophisticated communication systems. Winter brought concentration and intensification of social life. Groups would gather in sheltered locations, often river valleys where they had cached food supplies and established semi-permanent settlements. These winter gatherings were crucial for maintaining cultural traditions, arranging marriages, exchanging information, and sharing resources when times were difficult. The food procurement strategies of Mammoth Steppe peoples were remarkably diverse. While they're often portrayed as big-game hunters focused exclusively on mammoths, archaeological evidence reveals they exploited a wide range of resources. They hunted smaller animals like Arctic foxes and ptarmigan, gathered plant foods during the brief summer season, and learned to exploit seasonal runs of fish in the rivers that crossed the steppe. Food storage and preservation were crucial skills. The cold, dry climate of the Mammoth Steppe was actually advantageous for food preservation. Meat could be cached in permafrost storage pits that acted like natural freezers, keeping food fresh for months or even years. They developed techniques for drying meat and fat into portable high-energy foods that could sustain hunting parties during long journeys. Their tool technology was sophisticated and highly specialized. Beyond weapons and clothing tools, they created specialized implements for processing different types of resources. They had specific tools for working ivory, others for processing hides, and still others for working with bone and antler. The variety and sophistication of their toolkits rival those of much later agricultural societies. Fire management was perhaps their most important survival skill. On the largely treeless steppe, fuel for fires was always a challenge. They learned to use animal fat and bone as fuel sources, to collect and store dried dung for burning, and to carefully manage precious supplies of wood from the scattered groves that existed in protected valleys. Their fires served multiple purposes beyond warmth and cooking. Fire was used for hunting, driving animals into traps or forcing them into vulnerable positions. It was used for tool manufacture, heat-treating stone to improve its flaking properties and hardening wooden implements. Fire was also crucial for social and spiritual activities, providing the focus for storytelling, ceremonies, and community gatherings. The social organization of Mammoth Steppe peoples was flexible, and adaptive leadership was typically based on knowledge and experience rather than formal authority. The best hunters, the most skilled tool makers, and the keepers of crucial survival knowledge held influence within groups. Decisions were made collectively, with particular attention paid to the advice of elders who had survived many seasonal cycles. Trade networks connected groups across vast distances of the Mammoth Steppe. Archaeological evidence shows that materials like high-quality stone for tools, amber for decoration, and shells from distant seas moved hundreds or even thousands of miles through exchange networks. These trade relationships weren't just economic. They were social connections that maintained genetic diversity and cultural exchange across the sparse human populations. Their artistic achievements were remarkable, considering the harsh environment and mobile lifestyle. The famous Venus figurines found across the Mammoth Steppe region show sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and artistic technique. Cave paintings, though less common than in warmer regions, demonstrate detailed knowledge of animal anatomy and behavior. Carved ivory objects show artistic traditions that were maintained across generations. The spiritual life of Mammoth Steppe peoples seems to have been deeply connected to the animals they lived among. Burial practices often included grave goods made from mammoth ivory and other animal materials. Some burials show evidence of red ochre, suggesting complex ritual practices. The arrangement of mammoth bones in some archaeological sites suggests they may have had ceremonial as well as practical purposes. Their navigation skills were extraordinary. In a landscape that could appear monotonously uniform, they developed techniques for finding their way across vast distances. They learned to read subtle variations in topography, vegetation, and snow patterns. They used astronomical observations, wind patterns, and animal migration routes as navigation aids. The children of the Mammoth Steppe grew up in this world of giants, learning survival skills that seem almost superhuman by modern standards. By adolescence, they could track animals across difficult terrain, construct shelters from available materials, and contribute significantly to group survival. Their education was constant and experiential, based on observation and practice rather than formal instruction. Perhaps most remarkably, these people maintained their humanity in conditions that might seem to demand nothing but survival. They created art, maintained complex social relationships, developed rich cultural traditions, and passed down accumulated knowledge through oral traditions that preserved crucial survival information across generations. The relationship between humans and the Mammoth Steppe ecosystem was complex and probably contributed to the eventual collapse of the system. While early human populations were small and their impact limited, growing human numbers and improving hunting technologies may have begun to stress populations of key species like mammoths. The role of human hunting in the end Pleistocene extinctions remains debated, but it's clear that humans were becoming an increasingly important factor in Mammoth Steppe ecology. Understanding the lives of Mammoth Steppe peoples helps us appreciate both human adaptability and the complexity of the relationships between humans and their environment. These people weren't separate from the ecosystem they lived in. They were part of it, adapted to its rhythms, and dependent on its continued functioning for their survival. The Mammoth Steppe lived and breathed according to seasonal rhythms more extreme and demanding than any ecosystem on Earth experiences today. These weren't gentle transitions between spring, summer, fall, and winter, but dramatic transformations that completely altered the character of the landscape and the lives of every creature that called it home. Understanding these seasonal rhythms helps us appreciate the remarkable adaptations that allowed this ecosystem to flourish for tens of thousands of years. Let's follow the Mammoth Steppe through a complete yearly cycle, beginning with the harsh depths of winter when the landscape seemed locked in an icy death that might last forever. January on the Mammoth Steppe was a world transformed into something almost alien. Temperatures would plummet to 40 or 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, creating cold so intense it could freeze exposed skin in minutes. The air itself seemed solid, crystalline, and sharp enough to cut. Yet this was not the dead landscape it might have appeared. Beneath the thin layer of wind-swept snow, life persisted in forms perfectly adapted to these extreme conditions. Mammoth families, their thick wool coats frosted with ice crystals, would move slowly across the frozen grasslands, using their massive heads like snow plows to reveal the dried grasses beneath. The sound of their feeding, the scraping of tusks against frozen ground, the tearing of dried vegetation, the rumbling of enormous digestive systems, carried for miles in the crystalline air. Woolly rhinoceros, solitary and determined, would break through ice crusts with their powerful horns, creating feeding craters that other animals would quickly discover and share. Cave lions, their breath-forming clouds of vapor that immediately crystallized and fell as tiny ice particles, would follow the herds at a distance, waiting for weakness or opportunity. The winter light was extraordinary, low and golden when the sun appeared at all, creating long shadows that stretched for miles across the snow. During the deepest part of winter, the sun might not rise above the horizon for weeks at a time in the northernmost regions of the steppe, leaving the world illuminated only by starlight, moonlight, and the dancing curtains of the aurora borealis. But even in this apparent desolation, the ecosystem was actively functioning. The constant trampling and feeding of large animals kept areas of ground clear of insulating snow, allowing the permafrost to remain stable and cold. The dung of herbivores, frozen almost instantly in the bitter air, created stockpiles of nutrients that would fuel explosive plant growth when warmer weather returned. As February gave way to March, subtle changes began to appear. The sun climbed slightly higher each day, and periods of daylight began to extend. Snow that had been powder dry all winter might begin to develop a slight crust during brief periods of warmer temperature. Animals that had conserved energy through the darkest months began to show slightly more activity. The first real signs of approaching spring came in April, when temperatures might rise above 0 for a few hours during the middle of the day. This was enough to begin the transformation that would turn the frozen steppe into one of Earth's most productive ecosystems. Surface snow would begin to develop a hard crust that could support the weight of smaller animals, allowing them to move across terrain that had been difficult to navigate all winter. May brought the beginning of true spring, though it was a spring like no other on Earth today. As temperatures rose above freezing for longer periods each day, the thin layer of snow would begin to melt, creating a landscape of mud, standing water, and exposed earth. The sound of dripping and flowing water would begin to punctuate the silence that had dominated the winter months. This was a critical time for all life on the Mammoth Steppe. Animals that had survived on stored body fat and cached food supplies through the long winter were at their weakest point, just as the energy demands of spring activity began to increase. Predation pressure intensified as carnivores found their prey weakened and concentrated around the limited areas of accessible food. But as soil temperatures began to rise and the uppermost layers of permafrost started to thaw, something magical happened. The extensive root systems of steppe grasses, dormant but alive beneath the frozen ground, began to mobilize stored energy reserves. Within days of soil thaw, green shoots would begin to emerge from what had appeared to be barren earth. June marked the beginning of the growing season proper, and the transformation was breathtaking. Areas that had been brown and apparently lifeless would turn green almost overnight. The growth rate of steppe vegetation was extraordinary. Some grass species could grow several inches per week, rapidly creating lush meadows where frozen wasteland had existed just weeks before. The 24-hour daylight of the northern summer provided plants with nearly continuous energy for photosynthesis. The combination of intense sunlight, adequate moisture from snowmelt and early summer rains, and rich soils created growing conditions that allowed plants to achieve remarkable productivity in just a few months. This was the time of plenty for the animals of the Mammoth Steppe. Mammoths that had lost substantial weight during the winter began to rebuild their fat reserves on the nutritious new growth. Pregnant females gave birth to calves that would have the entire brief summer to grow and strengthen before facing their first winter. Bison, horses, and other herbivores spread across the vast landscape, taking advantage of the abundant forage. The summer was also breeding season for most species. The social dynamics of the steppe became more complex as animals that had concentrated in winter survival groups now spread across the landscape in breeding territories. Male mammoths would compete for mating rights, with tremendous battles that could be heard for miles. Cave lions would establish hunting territories to support their growing families. July and August represented the peak of Mammoth Steppe productivity. The grasslands were at their most lush, supporting incredible densities of large animals. A single square mile might support dozens of mammoths, hundreds of bison and horses, and all the predators and smaller animals that depended on them. The biomass of large animals per unit area exceeded that of modern African savannas. But even at the height of summer, the harsh realities of the Mammoth Steppe climate were never far away. Thunderstorms could bring sudden temperature drops and driving rain that reminded animals and plants alike that this abundance was temporary. Lightning strikes could ignite grass fires that would sweep across large areas of the steppe, clearing accumulated dead vegetation and creating opportunities for new plant establishment. The brief summer was a time of frantic activity for all species. Plants had to complete their entire reproductive cycle in just a few months, growing, flowering, producing seeds, and storing energy in root systems for the coming winter. Animals had to build up fat reserves, mate, raise young, and prepare for another 8 months of survival conditions. September brought the first signs that the growing season was ending. Frost might appear on some nights, and day length began to shorten noticeably. Plants began to transfer nutrients from leaves and stems to root systems, and the lush green of summer began to fade to the golden browns and tans of autumn. This was migration time for many species. Mammoth families would begin to move toward their winter ranges, following traditional routes passed down through generations of matriarchs. Bird populations that had swelled during the summer breeding season began their southward journeys. Even insects and other small creatures began to prepare for winter survival. October was a month of preparation and movement. Animals that had spread across the vast steppe during summer abundance began to concentrate in areas where winter survival would be possible. Competition for the best winter territories intensified. Animals that had not successfully built up adequate fat reserves faced the grim prospect of not surviving until spring. The first serious snows typically arrived in November, marking the beginning of the transformation back to winter conditions. But unlike the deep, insulating snows that characterize modern tundra regions, Mammoth Steppe snows were often light and wind-blown, creating the patchy cover that allowed large animals to access food throughout the winter months. December completed the cycle as the steppe settled into full winter conditions. The sun disappeared below the horizon in the northern regions, and temperatures dropped to levels that would persist for the next 4 months. Animals that had been active and social during the summer became focused entirely on survival. This seasonal cycle was repeated year after year for thousands of years, creating evolutionary pressures that shaped every aspect of Mammoth Steppe life. Plants evolved rapid growth strategies and efficient nutrient storage systems. Animals developed behavioral patterns, timed to take advantage of seasonal opportunities while surviving seasonal challenges. The timing of reproduction was crucial. Most large mammals gave birth in late spring or early summer, ensuring that young had maximum time to grow before facing their first winter. Predators timed their breeding to coincide with the abundance of vulnerable young prey. Even the timing of plant seed production was coordinated with animal migration patterns to ensure effective seed dispersal. The Mammoth Steppe's seasonal rhythms also created what ecologists call pulse reserve dynamics. The brief summer pulse of productivity had to sustain the entire ecosystem through 8 months of winter reserves. This created strong selection pressure for efficiency in energy storage and use. Weather patterns followed predictable seasonal cycles that animals and plants could anticipate and prepare for. Spring storms brought moisture needed for plant growth. Summer thunderstorms provided dramatic but brief disruptions. Autumn weather patterns influenced the timing of migrations and preparation activities. Winter weather, while harsh, was relatively stable and predictable. The extreme seasonal variations also created opportunities for different species to dominate at different times of year. Some animals were specialized for summer abundance, others for winter survival. This temporal partitioning of resources allowed the ecosystem to support greater diversity than would have been possible with more uniform conditions. Human societies on the Mammoth Steppe were also tightly synchronized with these seasonal rhythms. Their hunting strategies, settlement patterns, social activities, and cultural practices all revolved around the dramatic seasonal changes. Summer was time for mobility and resource gathering, winter for concentration and social intensification. The breakdown of these seasonal rhythms, as climate changed at the end of the Ice Age, was probably crucial to the collapse of the Mammoth Steppe ecosystem. When the timing of snowmelt, plant growth, animal migrations, and other seasonal events became unpredictable or mismatched, the finely tuned relationships that had sustained the ecosystem for millennia began to break down. Understanding these seasonal rhythms helps us appreciate the remarkable precision with which the Mammoth Steppe ecosystem operated. Every species, from the largest mammoth to the smallest ground squirrel, had to perfectly time their activities to survive and reproduce in this demanding but productive environment. Around 15,000 years ago, the Mammoth Steppe began to experience changes that would ultimately transform it beyond recognition and lead to the extinction of most of its magnificent inhabitants. This was not a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual unraveling that took place over several thousand years. A slow-motion collapse of one of Earth's most successful ecosystems. Understanding this great transformation helps us appreciate both the fragility and resilience of natural systems, and provides crucial insights into how ecosystems respond to environmental change. The seeds of change lay in shifting global climate patterns that began to alter the fundamental conditions that had sustained the Mammoth Steppe for tens of thousands of years. The massive ice sheets that had dominated northern regions began to retreat, fundamentally altering atmospheric circulation patterns. The cold, dry continental climate that had created and maintained the steppe started to give way to warmer, wetter conditions, more similar to what we see in northern regions today. Let's imagine ourselves witnessing the early stages of this transformation. The changes would have been subtle at first, perhaps winter temperatures that didn't drop quite as low as they had in previous years, or summer seasons that extended slightly longer than usual. Snow patterns might have begun to shift, with some areas receiving more snowfall that persisted longer into the spring. These seemingly minor changes had profound effects on the Mammoth Steppe ecosystem. The thin, wind-blown snow cover that had allowed large animals to access food throughout the winter began to change. In some areas, deeper, more persistent snow made winter foraging more difficult. The stable permafrost that had provided the foundation for grassland plant communities began to thaw more deeply during summer months. As atmospheric circulation patterns shifted, the Mammoth Steppe began to receive more precipitation, particularly during winter months. This additional moisture came primarily as snow, and crucially, this snow began to persist longer into the spring and accumulate to greater depths than the ecosystem's inhabitants were adapted to handle. The impact on plant communities was dramatic. The grasses and herbs that had thrived under cold, dry conditions found themselves struggling with increased soil moisture and changed seasonal patterns. Many steppe plant species were adapted to rapid spring growth following predictable snowmelt. When snow persisted longer and melted more gradually, it disrupted the finely tuned timing that had allowed these plants to maximize their brief growing season. As plant communities began to change, the effects cascaded throughout the ecosystem. The nutritious, high-protein grasses that had sustained millions of large herbivores were gradually replaced by different plant species better adapted to the new conditions. But these replacement species were often less nutritious and less accessible to the large grazers that depended on them. Mammoth populations were among the first to feel the pressure. These enormous animals required vast quantities of high-quality forage, and even small changes in plant productivity could have significant effects on their survival and reproduction. Archaeological evidence suggests that mammoth populations began to decline and become more fragmented as their preferred habitat became less reliable. The changing snow conditions were particularly problematic for mammoths and other large herbivores. Their survival strategy had depended on their ability to sweep away relatively thin snow cover to access the dried grasses beneath. When snow became deeper and more compacted, this became much more difficult and energy-intensive. Animals that had to work harder to find food during winter had less energy available for survival and reproduction. Permafrost stability was another crucial factor in the ecosystem's transformation. The Mammoth Steppe had depended on permanently frozen soil to maintain the cold, well-drained conditions that its plant communities required. As temperatures warmed and precipitation patterns changed, permafrost began to thaw more extensively during summer months, creating waterlogged conditions that many steppe plants could not tolerate. The feedback effects were devastating. As the large herbivores that had maintained the grassland through their grazing, trampling, and fertilizing activities became less abundant, the plant communities themselves began to change more rapidly. Without the constant disturbance created by mammoth herds, woody shrubs and eventually trees began to invade areas that had been pure grassland for thousands of years. This vegetation change created additional feedback effects that accelerated ecosystem transformation. Shrubs and trees held more snow than grasses had, creating deeper, more persistent snow cover. They also created more shade and transpired more moisture, contributing to cooler, wetter conditions at ground level. The light-colored grasses that had reflected sunlight and helped maintain cold conditions were replaced by darker vegetation that absorbed more heat. Human populations may have played a role in accelerating these changes. As climate change stressed mammoth populations and made them more vulnerable, human hunting pressure might have pushed some populations past their ability to recover. The relationship between climate change and human hunting in causing the Mammoth Steppe extinctions remains actively debated by scientists, but it's likely that both factors contributed to the ecosystem's collapse. Archaeological evidence shows that human populations were growing and their hunting technologies were becoming more sophisticated during the period of Mammoth Steppe transformation. Sites from this period show evidence of increasingly intensive mammoth hunting, with some locations containing the remains of dozens of mammoths. Whether this hunting was a cause of mammoth decline or simply took advantage of populations already stressed by climate change remains uncertain. The timing of extinctions across different regions provides clues about the transformation process. Mammoth populations disappeared first from the southern and western edges of their range, areas that experienced the most dramatic climate changes earliest. Northern and eastern populations persisted longer, with some mammoth populations surviving on islands in the Arctic Ocean until as recently as 4,000 years ago. Other large herbivores experienced similar patterns of decline and extinction. Woolly rhinoceros populations collapsed earlier than mammoths in most regions, perhaps because they were less adaptable to changing conditions. Cave lions and other large predators followed their prey into extinction as the food webs that had sustained them for millennia began to unravel. The transformation wasn't uniform across the vast expanse of the former Mammoth Steppe. Some areas transitioned relatively quickly to forest, particularly in regions that became warmer and wetter. Other areas became the sparse tundra landscapes we see today in the Arctic, supporting far fewer large animals than the productive grasslands they replaced. Still other regions became wetlands or even lakes as changing drainage patterns and thawing permafrost altered the landscape's hydrology. The speed of change varied dramatically by location and local conditions. In some areas, the transformation from productive steppe to modern tundra or forest might have taken only a few centuries. In others, remnants of steppe conditions persisted for thousands of years, supporting small populations of mammoth steppe species long after they had disappeared from most of their former range. The plant communities that replaced the Mammoth Steppe were fundamentally different in their structure and productivity. Where nutritious grasses had once supported enormous herds of large animals, mosses, sedges, and low shrubs created landscapes that could support only a fraction of the previous animal biomass. The intricate relationships between plants and large herbivores that had maintained steppe conditions for millennia were broken. Tree invasion was particularly significant in southern and western regions of the former steppe. As conditions became warmer and wetter, Birch, pine, and other tree species began to colonize areas that had been treeless grassland. Once established, these trees created their own microclimates, shadier, more humid, and less favorable to the grasses and herbs that had characterized the steppe. The loss of large herbivores created cascading effects throughout the ecosystem. Without mammoth dung to fertilize the landscape, soil fertility declined. Without the trampling and grazing that had maintained grassland plant communities, species composition shifted toward plants that were less nutritious for large animals. Without the snow-clearing activities of mega-herbivores, winter feeding became increasingly difficult for any surviving large animals. Some species managed to adapt to the changing conditions better than others. Caribou, smaller and more flexible in their habitat requirements than mammoths, were able to exploit the new tundra conditions. Musk oxen, already adapted to harsh Arctic conditions, survived in some regions. Wolves, as generalist predators, were able to shift their hunting strategies to focus on the smaller prey that became dominant in post-steppe ecosystems. But the overall result was a dramatic reduction in the diversity and abundance of large animals. Where the Mammoth Steppe had supported dozens of species of megafauna, the replacement ecosystems could support only a few. The biomass of large animals per unit area dropped by perhaps 90% or more, representing one of the most dramatic ecosystem transformations in Earth's recent history. The human societies that had adapted to life in the Mammoth Steppe world faced their own crisis as their environment transformed around them. The hunting strategies, tool technologies, and survival skills that had sustained human populations for thousands of years suddenly became less effective as their prey species declined and disappeared. Some human groups were able to adapt to the changing conditions. They developed new hunting strategies focused on smaller prey, learned to exploit fish and marine resources, and gradually adopted new technologies suited to forest or tundra environments. Others may have moved to regions where steppe conditions persisted longer, following the retreating grasslands eastward and northward. Archaeological evidence shows that human material culture changed dramatically during this period. The elaborate bone and ivory technologies that had characterized Mammoth Steppe peoples were gradually replaced by toolkits better suited to the new environments. The large, permanent settlements built from mammoth bones were abandoned in favor of more mobile lifestyles adapted to pursuing smaller, more dispersed prey. The end of the Mammoth Steppe also marked important changes in human social organization and cultural development. Some researchers suggest that the stress of adapting to post-Ice Age conditions may have accelerated cultural innovations that eventually led to the development of agriculture and more complex societies. Climate modeling studies suggest that the transformation of the Mammoth Steppe had effects on global climate patterns. The replacement of light-colored grasslands with darker forest and tundra vegetation would have absorbed more solar radiation, contributing to regional warming. The loss of large herbivores may have affected carbon cycling, as the deep-rooted grasses they had maintained were replaced by vegetation with different carbon storage characteristics. The permafrost changes associated with Mammoth Steppe transformation also had long-term consequences. Much of the organic carbon that had been stored in Mammoth Steppe soils began to decompose as permafrost thawed, releasing carbon dioxide and methane to the atmosphere. This process continues today in many Arctic regions, contributing to ongoing climate change. Some regions retained steppe-like conditions longer than others, creating refugia where Mammoth Steppe species could persist. The Bering Land Bridge region, parts of northern Siberia, and some Arctic islands maintained relatively dry, cold conditions that supported mammoth and other steppe species thousands of years after they had disappeared from most of their former range. The final extinction of mammoth populations provides insight into the transformation process. The last mammoth survived on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean until about 4,000 years ago, thousands of years after mainland populations had disappeared. These island populations were small and isolated, but their persistence shows that suitable habitat conditions could still support mammoths long after the main ecosystem had collapsed. Genetic studies of mammoth remains from different time periods show evidence of increasing inbreeding and genetic diversity loss as populations became smaller and more fragmented. This suggests that even surviving populations were under increasing stress as their habitat became more limited and fragmented. The transformation of the Mammoth Steppe represents more than just the extinction of charismatic megafauna. It was the collapse of an entire way of organizing life on Earth. The intricate relationships between climate, plants, animals, and even humans that had sustained this ecosystem for tens of thousands of years were broken in just a few millennia. Modern studies of the Mammoth Steppe transformation provide important insights into how ecosystems respond to rapid environmental change. The feedback loops that had maintained steppe conditions, between large animals and plants, between vegetation and climate, between different species within the community, proved vulnerable to disruption when key components of the system came under stress. The Mammoth Steppe transformation also demonstrates the importance of keystone species in maintaining ecosystem structure. The loss of mammoths and other large herbivores didn't just reduce animal diversity. It fundamentally altered the entire ecosystem by removing the processes that had maintained grassland conditions. Understanding this great transformation helps us appreciate both the remarkable success of the Mammoth Steppe ecosystem and the factors that led to its collapse. It shows us that even very successful and long-lasting ecosystems can be vulnerable to relatively rapid environmental changes, particularly when those changes affect the fundamental processes that maintain ecosystem structure and function. The legacy of the Mammoth Steppe transformation continues to influence northern ecosystems today. The modern Arctic landscape is, in many ways, still recovering from the loss of the Mammoth Steppe. Scientists studying climate change in the Arctic are finding that understanding Mammoth Steppe ecology is crucial for predicting how northern ecosystems might respond to current warming trends. Though the Mammoth Steppe vanished thousands of years ago, its echoes still whisper across the modern world in ways that continue to surprise and instruct us. Scientists exploring the frozen depths of Siberian permafrost, conservationists working to protect the last fragments of steppe-like habitat, and researchers studying climate change are all discovering that this ancient ecosystem holds keys to understanding our planet's past, present, and future. Let's begin our exploration of these modern echoes in the remote reaches of northern Siberia, where Russian scientist Sergei Zimov has spent decades studying what remains of the Mammoth Steppe world. In the 1980s, Zimov began to notice something remarkable in the sparse grasslands around his research station near the town of Chersky. In small areas where the native vegetation had been disturbed by vehicle tracks, construction activities, or natural events, the plants that grew back were different from the surrounding tundra. These recovering areas sprouted grasses and herbs that seemed oddly familiar when Zimov compared them to descriptions of Mammoth Steppe vegetation. Seeds that had been dormant in the soil for thousands of years were apparently still viable, waiting for the right conditions to germinate and recreate fragments of the ancient grassland ecosystem. This discovery led to one of the most ambitious ecological experiments of our time, Pleistocene Park. On a 20,000-hectare site in northeastern Siberia, Zimov and his colleagues have been working to recreate Mammoth Steppe conditions by reintroducing large herbivores and managing the landscape to encourage grassland development. The results have been remarkable. Areas where large herbivores graze intensively have begun to develop plant communities much more similar to reconstructions of Mammoth Steppe vegetation than to typical modern tundra. Horses, reindeer, and bison brought to the site have trampled and grazed the sparse shrubs and mosses, encouraging the growth of grasses and herbs. In winter, their feeding activities keep snow cover thin and patchy, much as mammoths once did across the ancient steppe. Temperature measurements in Pleistocene Park have shown that areas with intensive grazing by large animals remain significantly colder in winter than ungrazed control areas. The animals' snow-clearing activities expose the ground to bitter winter air, helping to maintain the permafrost conditions that characterized the Mammoth Steppe. This finding has profound implications for understanding how the loss of megafauna may have contributed to modern Arctic warming. Similar restoration projects are underway in other parts of the former Mammoth Steppe range. In Alaska, the Zimov family has established a sister site to the Siberian Pleistocene Park. European researchers are exploring whether large herbivores could be reintroduced to northern European grasslands to recreate steppe-like conditions. Each of these projects is providing insights into how the Mammoth Steppe ecosystem functioned and how it might be partially restored. But the echoes of the Mammoth Steppe extend far beyond these deliberate restoration attempts. Across the Arctic, climate researchers are discovering that understanding Mammoth Steppe ecology is crucial for predicting how northern ecosystems will respond to ongoing warming. The same feedback loops that maintained steppe conditions for thousands of years, relationships between vegetation, snow cover, permafrost, and animal activity, are still operating in modified forms today. Modern climate models are beginning to incorporate what scientists have learned about Mammoth Steppe dynamics. The realization that large herbivores could significantly influence regional climate through their effects on vegetation and snow cover has led to new research into how contemporary changes in Arctic animal populations might affect warming trends. The vast stores of carbon locked in Arctic permafrost represent another crucial connection between the Mammoth Steppe past and our climate future. Much of this carbon was originally incorporated into soils during the Mammoth Steppe period, when the deep-rooted grasses and intensive animal activity created conditions for extensive carbon storage. As modern warming causes permafrost to thaw, this ancient carbon is being released to the atmosphere, contributing to accelerating climate change. Scientists studying permafrost carbon are finding that understanding Mammoth Steppe soil formation is essential for predicting future carbon release. The organic matter in permafrost soils includes not just ancient plant material, but also mammoth dung, bones, and other animal remains that have been frozen for thousands of years. As this material thaws and decomposes, it releases both carbon dioxide and methane, greenhouse gases that accelerate warming and further permafrost thaw. The study of ancient Mammoth Steppe genetics is providing another window into this lost world. DNA extracted from permafrost samples is revealing the genetic diversity of Mammoth Steppe plant and animal communities with unprecedented detail. Scientists can now identify not just which species lived in particular locations, but how genetically diverse those populations were and how they changed over time. These genetic studies are yielding surprising discoveries about Mammoth Steppe ecology. Analysis of environmental DNA from different layers of permafrost has revealed that the transition from Mammoth Steppe to modern tundra involved not just species extinctions, but fundamental changes in the genetic diversity of surviving species. Plant populations that had been genetically diverse and widely connected during the Mammoth Steppe period became small, isolated, and genetically impoverished as the ecosystem fragmented. The implications extend to modern conservation efforts. Understanding how species responded genetically to past ecosystem collapse is informing strategies for protecting Arctic biodiversity under current climate change. Species that showed genetic resilience during the Mammoth Steppe transformation may be better candidates for conservation priority than those that suffered severe genetic bottlenecks. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal new aspects of Mammoth Steppe life and its modern relevance. Recent excavations in Siberia have uncovered mammoth bone houses with sophisticated ventilation systems and evidence of complex social organization among Mammoth Steppe peoples. These discoveries are changing our understanding of human adaptability and cultural development during the Ice Age. The technologies developed by Mammoth Steppe peoples continue to influence modern Arctic survival strategies. Traditional knowledge preserved by indigenous Arctic peoples includes techniques that may have originated during the Mammoth Steppe period. Modern Arctic researchers and military personnel study Ice Age survival strategies as they develop equipment and procedures for extreme cold weather operations. Museum collections around the world are benefiting from new discoveries of Mammoth Steppe specimens emerging from thawing permafrost. Remarkably preserved mammoth carcasses, complete with soft tissues, hair, and even stomach contents, are providing unprecedented insights into Mammoth Steppe ecology. These specimens allow scientists to study everything from mammoth DNA to the plant species they consumed in their final meals. The preservation quality of some mammoth remains has even led to discussions about the possibility of using modern genetic techniques to bring mammoths back to life. While true de-extinction remains technically challenging, researchers are making progress toward creating mammoth-like organisms that might be able to fill some of the ecological roles that mammoths played in maintaining steppe conditions. These genetic rescue efforts highlight the continuing relevance of Mammoth Steppe ecology. If large, cold-adapted herbivores could be reintroduced to the Arctic, they might help slow warming by maintaining the vegetation and snow conditions that keep permafrost stable. The Mammoth Steppe serves as a proof of concept that Arctic grasslands can support large animal populations and influence regional climate. Modern rewilding projects around the world draw inspiration from Mammoth Steppe restoration efforts. The success of large herbivores in modifying vegetation and ecosystem processes in Siberian experiments has encouraged similar projects in temperate grasslands, where bison, wild horses, and other large animals are being reintroduced to restore grassland ecosystems. The economic implications of Mammoth Steppe research are also becoming apparent. Tourism to sites like Pleistocene Park is growing as public interest in Mammoth Steppe restoration increases. The mammoth ivory trade, while controversial, continues to provide income for indigenous communities in Siberia who collect tusks from naturally eroding permafrost. More broadly, Mammoth Steppe research is contributing to the development of new approaches to ecosystem management under climate change. The recognition that ecosystems can exist in multiple stable states, like the transition between Mammoth Steppe and modern tundra, is influencing how managers think about conservation goals and intervention strategies. Educational institutions are incorporating Mammoth Steppe studies into curricula, ranging from paleontology to climate science. Students studying the Mammoth Steppe gain insights into ecological complexity, species interactions, and ecosystem dynamics that are relevant to understanding many contemporary environmental challenges. The Mammoth Steppe continues to capture public imagination through documentaries, books, and museum exhibitions. This popular interest is supporting continued research and conservation efforts while raising awareness about the connections between past and present environmental changes. Artists and writers continue to draw inspiration from Mammoth Steppe imagery and themes. The aesthetic of the Ice Age grasslands, vast, windswept, populated by magnificent giants, resonates with modern audiences concerned about environmental loss and the future of wild places. Scientific instruments and techniques developed for Mammoth Steppe research are finding applications in other fields. Ground-penetrating radar used to locate mammoth remains is being adapted for archaeological surveys in other environments. Genetic techniques developed for analyzing ancient permafrost DNA are being applied to other paleo-environmental studies. The Mammoth Steppe's influence on modern indigenous cultures in the Arctic continues to be documented by anthropologists and linguists. Traditional stories, place names, and cultural practices may preserve memories of the time when the Arctic supported large herds of megafauna. These cultural connections provide additional links between the ancient ecosystem and modern Arctic communities. International scientific collaboration on Mammoth Steppe research is fostering new partnerships between institutions in Russia, North America, and Europe. These collaborations are advancing not just Mammoth Steppe science, but broader understanding of Arctic ecosystem dynamics and climate change responses. The Mammoth Steppe also serves as a powerful example in discussions about rewilding and ecosystem restoration. Its demonstration that radically different ecosystem states are possible in the same geographic areas challenges conventional thinking about natural conditions and conservation targets. As we face an uncertain climate future, the Mammoth Steppe offers both warnings and hope. It shows us how quickly and dramatically ecosystems can change when environmental conditions shift. But it also demonstrates the remarkable productivity and stability that can be achieved when the right combination of climate, plants, and animals come together. The echoes of the Mammoth Steppe in our modern world remind us that we are still connected to this ancient ecosystem in ways we are only beginning to understand. Every time we study Arctic climate, examine permafrost soils, or consider ecosystem restoration, we are in dialogue with the Mammoth Steppe and the lessons it offers about life on our changing planet. As we reach the end of our journey through the Mammoth Steppe, let's pause for a moment in the quiet of this bedtime hour and reflect on the extraordinary world we've explored together. We've walked across grasslands that stretched from ocean to ocean, witnessed the daily lives of creatures beyond imagination, and followed the rise and fall of Earth's most productive ecosystem. But what does this ancient world, vanished for thousands of years, have to teach us as we drift toward sleep in our modern world? The Mammoth Steppe was, above all, a testament to the power of relationships. Not the simple relationships we might imagine between predator and prey, or between plant and soil, but intricate webs of connection that bound together every living thing in an enormous, coordinated dance of survival. The mammoths that cleared snow with their massive heads were not just feeding themselves, they were maintaining the permafrost, supporting the grasses, and creating opportunities for dozens of other species. The bison that grazed the grasslands were not just consuming vegetation, they were stimulating plant growth, distributing nutrients, and maintaining the very conditions that allowed the grasslands to thrive. In our modern world, we sometimes forget how deeply interconnected all life truly is. We live in cities and towns where the relationships between living things can seem distant and abstract. But the Mammoth Steppe reminds us that we are still part of this web of connections, still dependent on the same kinds of relationships that sustained life for thousands of years on the ancient grasslands. The story of the Mammoth Steppe is also a story about adaptation and resilience. For tens of thousands of years, this ecosystem persisted through climate variations that would have destroyed less robust communities. Ice ages came and went. Volcanic eruptions changed atmospheric conditions, and yet the Mammoth Steppe endured. It endured because every species within it was perfectly adapted not just to the physical environment, but to each other. The grasses stored energy in their roots and remained nutritious even when dried and dormant. The mammoths developed the tools and behaviors needed to access food through the harshest winters. The predators learned to hunt cooperatively, to bring down prey much larger than themselves. The humans who lived in this world developed some of the most sophisticated survival technologies our species has ever created. Each adaptation made the whole system stronger. Yet adaptation and resilience have their limits, as the Mammoth Steppe's eventual transformation teaches us. Even the most successful ecosystems can be vulnerable when change comes too quickly or affects too many fundamental processes at once. The Mammoth Steppe could adapt to gradual climate variation, but when temperature, precipitation, and vegetation patterns all shifted rapidly at the end of the Ice Age, the intricate relationships that had sustained it for millennia began to break down. This offers us both humility and hope as we face our own rapidly changing world. Humility because it reminds us that even very successful systems can be vulnerable to disruption. Hope because it shows us the remarkable things that are possible when species work together in harmony with their environment. The human story within the Mammoth Steppe is particularly meaningful as we consider our own relationship with the natural world. The people of the Mammoth Steppe were not separate from their ecosystem. They were fully integrated parts of it. They understood the rhythms of the seasons, the behavior of the animals, the properties of the plants. Their survival depended on maintaining these relationships and passing the knowledge needed to sustain them from generation to generation. Modern life can make us feel disconnected from these natural rhythms. We experience climate through windows and weather reports rather than through direct dependence on seasonal cycles. We obtain our food from stores rather than from intimate knowledge of the landscape. Yet we remain as dependent on natural systems as the Mammoth Steppe peoples ever were. We've just made those dependencies more complex and less visible. Perhaps one of the most important lessons the Mammoth Steppe offers is about the value of diversity. This ecosystem supported an extraordinary variety of life forms, from microscopic soil organisms to 6-ton mammoths, and this diversity was key to its stability and productivity. Different species filled different roles, exploited different resources, and responded differently to environmental challenges. When one species faced difficulties, others could maintain ecosystem functions. In our modern world, we're witnessing a global loss of biological diversity that some scientists compare to the extinctions that ended the Mammoth Steppe. The lesson from the ancient grasslands is clear. Diversity isn't just beautiful or interesting. It's essential for the stability and resilience of the systems that support all life. The Mammoth Steppe also teaches us about the power of keystone species, organisms whose influence on their ecosystem is disproportionately large compared to their numbers. Mammoths were keystone species par excellence, their activities maintaining the very conditions that allowed the grassland ecosystem to exist. When they disappeared, the entire system transformed. This reminds us to pay attention to the keystone species in our own ecosystems and to be thoughtful about how our activities affect them. In many modern ecosystems, humans have become keystone species ourselves, with the power to maintain or transform entire landscapes through our choices and actions. The story of Mammoth Steppe restoration efforts gives us reason for cautious optimism about our ability to repair damaged ecosystems. The work being done in Pleistocene Park and similar projects shows that even ecosystems that have been transformed for thousands of years may retain the potential for restoration. Seeds can remain viable in soil for millennia. Species retain genetic memories of how to thrive in conditions their ancestors knew. Ecological processes can be re-established if we're willing to invest the effort and patience required. But restoration efforts also remind us that prevention is far more effective than repair. The Mammoth Steppe took thousands of years to develop its remarkable productivity and diversity. Modern restoration efforts, impressive as they are recovering only fragments of what once existed. The lesson is clear. It's far easier to maintain healthy ecosystems than to restore damaged ones. As we consider the Mammoth Steppe's relevance to climate change, we're reminded that ecosystems are not passive victims of environmental conditions. They actively influence climate through their own processes. The Mammoth Steppe helped maintain the cold, dry conditions that sustained it. Modern ecosystems continue to influence regional and global climate patterns through their effects on temperature, moisture, and atmospheric chemistry. This gives us both responsibility and agency in addressing current environmental challenges. Our actions affect not just individual species or local environments, but the global systems that regulate Earth's climate. At the same time, by working with natural processes rather than against them, we may be able to achieve more effective results than we might expect. The seasonal rhythms that governed Mammoth Steppe life offer us a different perspective on time and patience. In our instant communication, rapid change world, it's easy to forget that many of the most important processes in life operate on much longer timescales. The Mammoth Steppe's annual cycle of abundance and scarcity, growth and dormancy, reminds us that sustainable systems often require periods of rest and renewal. Perhaps we, too, need to learn to work with longer rhythms, to plan not just for immediate needs, but for the health of systems over generations. The Mammoth Steppe peoples passed crucial survival knowledge from parents to children across thousands of years. What knowledge are we passing to future generations about how to live sustainably on our planet? The story of the Mammoth Steppe is ultimately a story about home, about what it means to belong to a place so completely that your survival and the survival of that place become inseparable. Every species in the Mammoth Steppe was perfectly at home there, adapted not just to the climate and geography, but to each other. As you settle into sleep tonight, surrounded by the comfort and safety of your own home, remember that you, too, are part of an ecosystem. The food you ate today, the air you breathe, the water you drink, all come to you through the same kinds of intricate relationships that sustained life on the Mammoth Steppe. You are connected to soil organisms and pollinators, to forests and oceans, to the great cycles of water and carbon that circle our planet. The Mammoth Steppe is gone, but its lessons remain. It teaches us about resilience and vulnerability, about cooperation and adaptation, about the power of diversity and the importance of keystone species. Most importantly, it reminds us that we are not separate from nature. We are part of it, dependent on its health for our own survival and flourishing. Sleep well, knowing that you carry forward the same capacity for adaptation and cooperation that allowed our species to thrive alongside giants in one of Earth's most remarkable ecosystems. Tomorrow brings new challenges and opportunities, but also the same fundamental truth that sustained life on the Mammoth Steppe. We are all connected, and our individual well-being depends on the health of the whole. In your dreams tonight, perhaps you'll walk again across those endless grasslands, hear the thunder of hooves on frozen ground, and feel the bite of clean, cold air that once filled the lungs of mammoths. The Mammoth Steppe lives on in our imagination, and our commitment to understanding and protecting the natural world that continues to sustain us all. Good night.